Hey guys, tonight we drift back to the moment the guns went quiet, but the world didn't. You stand there, ankle deep in mud and cigarette ash, staring at a sky that no longer spits fire. It's over, they say, the war to end all wars, again. But you, a soldier from one of the Axis powers, realize that peace is just a new word for uncertainty. The flags have changed, the front lines dissolved, yet danger lingers in strange new shapes. Hunger, captivity, revenge. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Maybe we'll find out who's the latest night owl in the room. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a young man in 1945. Or maybe an old one after what you've seen. The world has been rebuilt and ruined in equal measure. Across Europe and Asia, millions of Axis soldiers wander a broken planet. For some, surrender means a hot meal and a train ticket home. For others, it means years of hard labor, nameless graves under foreign skies, or the slow fading of loyalty into regret. The statistics are staggering. 11 million German soldiers in Allied hands. Hundreds of thousands of Italians divided by a shifting alliance, and more than 500,000 Japanese prisoners scattered from Siberia to Guam. You might think that once the shooting stopped, mercy would begin. But the truth is messier. The victor's justice came with degrees, and who captured you often mattered more than what you'd done. Imagine you're Italian, fighting in Greece in 1943. One day, the king betrays Mussolini, signs an armistice, and your officers vanish overnight. By dusk, you don't even know which army you belong to. The Germans call you a traitor. The Allies call you a curiosity. You are suddenly an enemy to everyone. And you're not alone. Hundreds of thousands of your comrades experience that same vertigo, scattered from the Aegean to North Africa. Or maybe you're a German infantryman, captured in the ruins of Cologne. The Americans hand you a tin of corned beef, the first real food you've had in weeks. But in the Soviet zone, it's different. You march eastward, the horizon fading into a blur of exhaustion. They tell you it's just a reconstruction project. You'll be home soon. Years later, you'll still be waiting. Somewhere else, a Japanese soldier steps off a crowded ship in Yokohama. No longer the emperor's blade, but a broken man. The cities are dust, his family gone, his country occupied by foreigners who speak a clipped, fast English. He can't decide whether the shame burns worse than the hunger. You realize that what happened after the war isn't a single story. It's millions of them, crisscrossing continents. For every Italian sipping tea in a British farmhouse, there's another shivering in a Soviet camp. For every German POW who learned English from kind farmers in Kansas, there's one digging ditches in Siberia under a frozen sun. And for every Japanese soldier who returned home in 1946, another stayed hidden in a jungle, convinced the war never ended. Historians still argue whether these fates reflected justice, vengeance, or simply the chaos of post-war politics. The Geneva Convention was supposed to be clear: humane treatment, no forced labor, no revenge. But those pages blurred under hunger and rubble. Western camps followed the rules more often than not, while Soviet and even some French systems saw the line between punishment and survival dissolve. Here's a quirky tidbit you probably didn't know. In Texas, Italian prisoners of war built miniature chapels out of scrap wood and paint. Some of those still stand today, tiny testaments to the odd tenderness that can bloom between enemies. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, prisoners carved makeshift rosaries out of breadcrumbs, whispering prayers through frost-bitten lips. You might wonder, as you drift between sleep and thought, how anyone could endure it. Yet survival is stubborn. A German POW in Kansas learned carpentry from his captors, returned home years later, and rebuilt his bombed-out house with the same hands that once held a rifle. An Italian farm worker who met an English widow during captivity stayed after repatriation, trading Mussolini's slogans for the hum of English rain. And somewhere, under Soviet skies, men marked the passing of time not with calendars, but with the length of their shadows at noon, each day shorter, each year longer. The world's moral compass was trying to recalibrate itself, spinning wildly after 6 years of destruction. You'd think the victors had all the answers, but even they were exhausted, their empathy rationed like sugar. In the American South, German POWs ate in segregated cafeterias, better food than Black American soldiers who served in the same war. In France, captives cleared minefields barefoot, their lives measured in detonations per hour. The war had ended, but the hierarchy of humanity hadn't. As you picture these faces, Italian, German, Japanese, you feel how blurred victory becomes when seen up close. Some found decency in unexpected places. Others learned that survival wasn't about sides, but about who still had food, warmth, or mercy to spare. So tonight, as you close your eyes and listen to the hum of the fan, remember this. For millions of Axis soldiers, the real battle began after the peace treaty. It was the battle to stay alive, to stay human, and, if lucky, to find a reason to live in a world that no longer wanted them. Tomorrow night, we'll follow one of them more closely, an Italian soldier who wakes up to find the war still raging, but his flag gone. You wake up to gunfire, but this time it's not aimed at the enemy. It's September 8th, 1943. The air smells like rain and burnt gasoline. You're somewhere in Greece, part of the Italian 11th Army. But your officers are gone. Your radio, silent. Someone whispers that the king has fled Rome, that Mussolini has been arrested, that Italy has switched sides. You blink, trying to make sense of it. Yesterday, you were fighting the British. Today, they're supposed to be allies. And the Germans, your comrades for 3 long years, are suddenly the ones loading their rifles at you. You probably won't survive this, you think. And you're not wrong. Across the Mediterranean, chaos ripples like a dropped stone. 500,000 Italian troops are scattered from the Balkans to the North African desert. The armistice should mean safety, but instead, it opens the gates of hell. In one stroke, Italy ceases to be a unified belligerent force and becomes 2 nations at war with themselves. The royalist government under Badoglio joining the Allies, and the puppet Italian Social Republic in the north still chained to Hitler's dying empire. You can almost hear the confusion echoing through the hills of Cephalonia, where the Acqui division refuses to surrender its weapons to German command. For 6 days they hold out, Italian against German, until the last bullet runs dry. What follows is massacre, one of the darkest footnotes of the war. Thousands of Italians shot or drowned by their former allies. Historians still argue whether Berlin ordered it directly or whether it was field commanders venting fury at betrayal. Either way, the sea turned red, and the beaches of the Ionian Islands became graves. Further north, in Yugoslavia and the Dodecanies, it's the same story in miniature. Shattered loyalties, frantic negotiations, columns of disarmed Italians forced to march into captivity. Some are sent east, others west. It all depends on whose trucks arrive first. If you're one of the unlucky majority caught in German zones, you'll soon learn a new phrase: Italienische Militärinterniert, or Italian military internee. It sounds bureaucratic, almost polite, but behind that label lies a quiet cruelty. Because by calling you an internee rather than a prisoner of war, the Germans neatly sidestep the Geneva Convention. No Red Cross visits, no pay, no protection. You've become invisible ink in the paperwork of empire. You're herded onto trains bound for Austria or Poland. The doors seal, and daylight shrinks to a narrow beam through the slats. You count the days by the number of times the train stops for water. The man beside you dies before the 3rd halt. You help lift him to the door so the guards can drag him out like luggage. Back home, your family listens to rumors. Some say you joined the resistance. Others believe you were executed for treason. In truth, You'll spend the next 2 winters hauling stones for German rail projects, sleeping under leaking roofs, trading bits of bread for cigarette butts. Around 40 in every 1,000 of you will die each year from disease, frostbite, or a simple refusal to keep breathing. And yet, somewhere amid the barbed wire, a strange kind of survival culture forms. Italians craft little theater troupes in their barracks, performing sketches mocking both Mussolini and Hitler. They carve playing cards from wood scraps, paint saints onto tin plates, and whisper news about the Allied advance like bedtime stories. There's even an ironic comfort in routine. The morning roll call, the scraping of spoons in thin soup, the silence after lights out. You stop dreaming about freedom and start dreaming about warm bread. Meanwhile, in Allied zones, your countrymen live a different war. Those captured earlier by the British or Americans are reclassified after the armistice as co-belligerents. In dusty camps across the American South, Italian prisoners suddenly find themselves cutting corn instead of shooting rifles. You can almost picture it. Neat rows of crops under a wide Texas sky, the smell of tobacco barns, the faint twang of a radio playing swing music. At first, the locals eye them with suspicion. But when they see these supposed enemies teaching Sunday school to farm children or building ornate chapels from leftover plaster, curiosity replaces hostility. Some of those chapels still stand, tiny whitewashed structures hidden between cotton fields, their altars built from scavenged tiles. Quirky, yes, but also quietly beautiful. Historians still debate whether this leniency was pure pragmatism or an early gesture toward reconciliation. The Allies needed manpower, after all. The war industry devoured labor faster than enlistment could replace it. So thousands of Italians volunteered, or were invited, into special work programs, repairing machinery, unloading cargo, even helping American units communicate with newly liberated towns. They called these detachments Italian service units. It's hard to say whether the decision was patriotic or desperate. For most, it simply meant better food, small pay, and the dignity of movement beyond the wire. You can imagine yourself wearing a new badge, olive drab instead of gray, translating for officers or cooking for soldiers who once shelled your convoy. There's a peculiar sense of freedom in that contradiction. One story tells of an Italian mechanic stationed near Chicago who fixed engines for the U.S. Army Air Forces. After the war, he married the daughter of the farmer whose land bordered the camp and stayed for life. A captured enemy turned immigrant neighbor. But back in Europe, things grow darker. For every story like his, another ends in the frozen East. Around 65,000 Italians fall into Soviet hands, some captured alongside the collapsing Axis forces on the Eastern Front, others liberated from German camps only to be deported again. Out of those, barely 20,000 will ever make it home. The rest vanish into the steppe. If you're one of them, your new address reads like a grim postcard. Tambov, Suzdal, or Krasnogorsk. You chop wood in -30 cold, build roads with your bare hands, sleep 10 to a hut. The Red Army guards aren't always cruel, just indifferent. Hunger is the real warden. You learn to swallow snow to numb your stomach. Some prisoners trade songs for soup. The Soviets love Italian melodies, especially when drunk on potato spirits. You stop counting days. Instead, you count how many times you see a crow. They mean someone left crumbs. Far away, politicians in Rome try to reconstruct what's left of their nation. Badoglio's government promises the Allies loyalty, while fascist diehards in the north promise Hitler vengeance. You're stuck between ghosts. Letters from home take months, if they arrive at all. When they do, they speak in cautious code. The garden grows again, or your brother works for the new people. You wonder which new people they mean. And yet, you cling to a stubborn belief that the world beyond the wire still remembers you. Maybe your mother lights a candle every Sunday. Maybe your name sits etched on a village wall, not yet carved with a date of death. By 1945, the war officially ends. But for you, captivity drags on. Even after Germany's surrender, the Soviets hesitate to repatriate prisoners. They're rebuilding their own ruins with free labor. You watch the seasons flip: mud, snow, dust, rain. In the West, your countrymen are already sipping coffee in Birmingham cafes. In the East, you're still a ghost. A curious fact historians often note: when those Eastern survivors finally returned in 1946 to 47, their train home crossed landscapes so changed that many couldn't recognize them. One wrote in his diary, "I returned, but my country did not." It's easy to forget that history's clean lines, armistice dates, surrender documents, never match human timelines. The paper may say peace, but the body keeps warring for years after. As night thickens around you, you picture those parallel Italies: the free laborers in Kansas, the internees in Saxony, the skeletons in Tambov, and realize that a nation can fracture not just in politics but in memory. For decades afterward, Italians will argue over who the real patriots were: those who resisted Germany or those who simply endured captivity. Both suffered, both vanished in the margins of victory. The war had made everyone a prisoner of something: ideology, hunger, or silence. And as you close your eyes tonight, the echo of 1943 still rustles through olive groves and cornfields alike, whispering the same bewildered question: whose side was I on, really? The war has ended for you, at least on paper. You're one of those Italian soldiers captured early, maybe in North Africa or Sicily, before Mussolini's collapse turned everything upside down. Now you're thousands of miles from home, behind barbed wire that feels more like a strange form of safety than punishment. You're in America. It's 1944, and the desert sun beats down on the flatlands of Texas. Or maybe you're in a green valley somewhere in Pennsylvania, the kind that looks like the backdrop of a movie you once saw before the war. You wear a patch on your sleeve with the letters PW stitched in white. The guards call you Tony because to them, all Italians are Tonys. You smile because they mean it kindly. You spend your mornings harvesting cotton, your afternoons learning English words like tractor, cowboy, and supper. The work is heavy, yes, but after years of hunger and dust, it feels like a kind of peace. There's food, plenty of it. Canned peaches, thick bread, even meat on Sundays. Compared to what your comrades face in Europe, it's paradise with fences. Historians still argue whether the Americans treated prisoners so well out of principle or practicality. Geneva Convention compliance looked good for propaganda, of course, but the truth is simpler. The US had a labor shortage. Too many men at the front, not enough hands to pick the crops. And you, a former invader, become an unlikely solution. At first, farmers watch you from a distance. Some refuse to let you near their families, convinced you're dangerous. But when they see you kneel to pet a farm dog or sing Italian folk songs while hoeing rows of corn, the tension thaws. Before long, local kids start sneaking to the fence to exchange words in broken English. One day, a farmer's wife brings extra biscuits by accident, and you all pretend not to notice. You learn that even in captivity, dignity is possible. There's a quirk of history you might find amusing. Some American camps had what they called camp universities. You could take classes, real ones, taught by fellow POWs who'd once been engineers, architects, or professors. One camp in Colorado even published its own newspaper. Another organized art exhibits with paintings made from toothpaste and coffee grounds. It was a small rebellion of the mind, a way to say, we're still human. And because you're Italian, you have a flair for making beauty out of scarcity. You carve chess pieces from peach pits. You decorate your bunk with folded paper flowers. You even form a choir that practices each evening at sunset, your voices floating beyond the wire. Sometimes, nearby townsfolk stop their trucks to listen. The guards don't stop you, they clap. By 1944, everything shifts again. News spreads that Italy has switched sides. You're told you can join something called the Italian Service Units, work detachments supporting the Allied war effort. The offer sounds absurd at first. Help the same people who locked you up? But when they explain that volunteers get better pay, extra rations, and most importantly, weekend passes, suddenly patriotism tastes like coffee and freedom. About 75% of Italian POWs in the US say yes. You sign the papers, trade your patch for a new uniform without the PW, and find yourself driving supply trucks, maintaining aircraft, or translating letters. You even get paid $50 a day, roughly what a US private earns. You're not technically free, but it feels close. Your American guards become coworkers, some even friends. You share cigarettes, swap stories about families, and laugh at the same jokes, though half the time you don't fully understand them. Historians still debate whether this was the beginning of post-war reconciliation or just smart logistics. But to you, it feels like a glimpse of the future, a world where enemies share the same lunch table. Still, not everything is easy. A few American soldiers bristle at the sight of you walking around camp without chains, or worse, chatting up local girls on your day off. There's a bar fight one night, and the newspapers call it a misunderstanding. Everyone involved is quietly transferred elsewhere. You learn the unspoken rule: stay invisible, work hard, smile politely. The oddest part? Some Americans envy you. They see your calmness, your ability to laugh even in confinement, your songs about home, and they wish they could feel that kind of peace. You guys don't hate anyone, a sergeant says once, shaking his head. You think about the fields of Greece and the streets of Rome, about the bombings and betrayals, and realize he's wrong. But maybe he needs to believe it. In the evenings, you sit outside your barracks, watching the horizon bleed into orange and gold. Somewhere across the Atlantic, your homeland is being torn in half. Germans retreat north, partisans rise in the mountains, and Mussolini hangs in effigy from lampposts. You hear rumors, fascists shot by firing squads, towns celebrating liberation, but they sound like fairy tales told in another language. For you, the war is over in everything but paperwork. Sometimes you dream about the day you'll go home. You imagine walking through your old village, rebuilt and alive again. You picture the bakery, the church bells, your mother's hands. But when the day finally comes, in 1946 or 1947, after years of waiting, the homecoming isn't what you expected. Your town has changed. People look at you differently. Some think you're a hero for surviving. Others whisper that you're a coward for surrendering. They don't understand that surrender was the only option left, that living was its own rebellion. A few of your campmates never make it back at all. They fall in love with the land of their captors, marry, and stay. The American Midwest gains a handful of Italian surnames that still linger in small towns today. Proof that even captivity can plant strange seeds of belonging. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, those captured by the British live through a mirror version of your story. Camps stretch across the empire, from Scotland's misty highlands to the plains of Kenya and the deserts of Egypt. The same routines repeat: work, study, small freedoms. In South Africa, some Italians become so integrated that after the war, they start their own cafes and vineyards. The enemy turns out to be excellent at making wine. There's a quiet irony in it all. The very war that scattered millions of men across continents also connected worlds that might never have met otherwise. You, a farmer's son from Naples, now know the taste of American cornbread and the scent of eucalyptus in South Africa. You've spoken more English in 2 years of captivity than in any classroom. You've learned that kindness can wear any uniform. And yet, guilt sits beside gratitude. You think of the friends who weren't so lucky, the ones labeled traitors and shipped to Germany, or the ones frozen in Soviet camps. You remember their faces every time someone jokes about how easy your war was. A quirky bit of trivia floats around later. In Britain, Italian POWs were allowed to attend church services with civilians, and sometimes even shared tea afterward. In one Welsh village, locals invited prisoners to a Christmas dance. Years later, one of those POWs returned, not as a captive, but as a groom. It's a reminder that history's borders are softer than the maps suggest. As you drift through the memory, you feel the absurd comfort of routine. The 8-hour workday, the clean clothes, the way the camp's loudspeaker plays Glenn Miller records on Sundays. You've stopped feeling like a prisoner, but you're not free either. It's a strange purgatory between two lives. When repatriation finally comes, it's bittersweet. You leave behind a country that fed and clothed you better than your own, heading back to ruins and ration cards. You wonder whether you're still Italian or something new, half American, half stateless. Historians still argue whether Allied leniency was moral high ground or just good politics. You don't care anymore. You care that you survived, that you can still dream of home, that you can still sleep without hearing bombs. As the ship pulls away from New York Harbor, you look back at the Statue of Liberty, so familiar from postcards and propaganda, and whisper something only you can hear. Grazie, but addio. You're no longer behind a fence, though it still feels like one follows you. The barbed wire has simply gone invisible. It's 1944, and the Allies have offered you a deal. Work for us, and we'll treat you like a man again. You don't hesitate long. They call it the Italian service units, a phrase so bland it almost hides its significance. What it really means is redemption, or maybe just a chance to move. You trade your POW patch for a new armband marked ISU, and step out of confinement into something halfway between freedom and duty. The American officer smiles when he hands you your tools, saying, "Congratulations, soldier. You're helping the good guys now." You don't correct him. You're just grateful to breathe fresh air without counting the meters of fence. Across the United States, more than 60,000 Italians take this offer. You might find yourself in a motor pool repairing Jeeps, or in a warehouse sorting supplies for the front. Some units work alongside American women in war factories, a strange twist of fate that makes everyone a little self-conscious at first. You're still technically a prisoner, but you earn pay, $50 a day, and can buy coffee, soap, even postcards. You write home, though you're not sure the letters will ever arrive. You start to realize that your captors are changing too. American officers who once barked orders now greet you with a nod. They invite you to join them for church services, sometimes even for dinner. There's a kind of quiet respect that grows in the small, practical rhythms of shared labor. One afternoon, while repairing an engine, a U.S. sergeant jokes that your accent makes every sentence sound romantic. You laugh, replying in halting English that his doesn't. He throws you a pack of Lucky Strikes and tells you to keep the change. Historians still debate whether these Italian service units were true cooperation or just clever exploitation. You don't think about it that way. For you, it's survival with dignity attached. You remember hunger in Tunisia, the cruelty of the march under German custody, and you know which side of the fence smells like bread. Still, not everyone approves. There are those, both American and Italian, who think you've betrayed something sacred. Some US soldiers can't forgive Italy's years with Hitler. They look at you as if your handshake carries a stain. And in your homeland, fascist loyalists spit at the thought of co-belligerents. They call you traitors who traded bayonets for brooms. It's strange to think that while you sweep an airfield in Louisiana or unload cargo in San Francisco, your own countrymen fight and die in the same war, on both sides. The Italian Social Republic fights to the bitter end with the Germans, while the new Royalist army under the Allies marches north. Somewhere in that chaos, your own flag is split like a torn photograph. But here, on this side of the ocean, the war feels distant, muted. You learn to whistle American tunes, to joke about ration lines, to read the newspapers when you can. The headlines are grim but predictable. Normandy landings successful, Rome liberated, German lines breaking. You nod quietly, knowing that the news means you're one step closer to a ticket home. There's one thing you can't get used to, though: the guilt. Every night you wonder what your mother thinks of you, if she imagines you safe, or if she believes you died for the wrong side. You wonder if she'd understand that you're not fighting anymore, just living. And then there are the stories that make you question what enemy even means. In one camp in Utah, an Italian service unit helps build irrigation systems for nearby farms. When a drought hits, the farmers share their water ration with the Italians, who in turn bake bread for the townsfolk using old family recipes. The resulting loaves win a county fair prize under the name Peace Bread, a small, soft rebellion in the shape of dough. In another camp near Fort Sheridan, a group of Italian prisoners turn their mess hall into a theater, performing Shakespeare with Italian accents and cardboard props. Local families attend. At the final act, when one of them recites Hamlet's "What a piece of work is man," even the guards applaud. You realize that these little absurdities, bread, theater, laughter, are how peace actually begins. Not in treaties or conferences, but in boredom turned to kindness. A curious fact: the U.S. War Department allowed ISU men to attend Mass without escorts. The local priests often refused payment, saying, "They've already given enough." The contrast to your comrades in German or Soviet captivity feels almost unreal. There, faith is rationed like bread. Here, it's freely offered. Still, there are reminders that you are not free. You can't leave the camp perimeter without permission. You can't write to the local paper or attend dances. You are invisible by law, a ghost worker in khaki. Then one Sunday, an officer announces that Italy has declared war on Germany. The room goes silent. Someone mutters, "So now we fight them again?" The laughter that follows is hollow, half disbelief, half exhaustion. You've already fought everyone there was to fight. By the spring of 1945, victory feels inevitable. You help pack supplies for the final push into Germany. Some of your unit's mechanics volunteer to assist Italian-American soldiers in Europe, not to fight, but to rebuild. Bridges, depots, hospitals. They write home about the rubble of Naples, about the same cobblestone streets they once marched through, now buried in debris. When the news of Mussolini's death reaches the camp, no one cheers. A few men cross themselves. Others stare at the dirt. Whatever he was, leader, tyrant, fool, his end feels like the last page of a book you can't bear to reread. After Germany surrenders, things change quickly. The fences come down, and you're free to walk the perimeter without being stopped. Some officers even allow you to visit nearby towns. You go to a diner, taste Coca-Cola for the first time, and decide it's too sweet. But you drink it anyway, because it tastes like tomorrow. Then come the farewells. Men who've shared years of captivity pack their bags with souvenirs, photographs, handmade rosaries, a few American magazines. You watch the guards shake hands with prisoners as equals. Some exchange addresses. You realize that for many of you, these strange friendships will outlast the war itself. A quirky tidbit buried in post-war archives mentions how one American colonel wrote to the War Department recommending that Italian service unit veterans be granted U.S. residency for exemplary service. The request was denied, but years later, many of those men immigrated anyway. They had already tasted the life they wanted. Historians still argue whether the Italian service units represent exploitation or the beginning of reconciliation between Italy and the West. But on quiet nights, when you think of it, all you remember are the small mercies, the laughter, the hot meals, the music drifting through camp speakers. You also remember how the guards once joked that you Italians worked slower when it was cold. You replied, "We're conserving energy for the peace." Everyone laughed, but a few nodded as if you'd said something profound. When repatriation orders finally arrive, there's no ceremony, just names read from a clipboard and a bus idling outside the gate. You board it with mixed feelings, gratitude and sadness braided together. The driver waves as if you're old friends. You leave behind a country that once called you an enemy, but fed you better than your own did. You wonder what it means to be loyal, to whom, and whether that question even has an answer anymore. The road ahead leads back to Italy, a homeland in ruins, where fascists hang from lampposts and old loyalties are burned like old uniforms. You'll step off the ship to a country pretending it never loved Mussolini, where politicians will say, "We were victims, not collaborators." And you'll know, deep down, that truth is never that clean. But that's for later. Tonight, as the train hums through the American plains on your way to the harbor, you press your forehead to the glass. The fields pass by in gold streaks. Somewhere beyond them, the war has ended, and you are still here, alive, confused, but free in a way that no side ever promised. You wake up to a whistle shrieking in the dark. The train slows, brakes screeching against frost-slick rails. The German guard outside shouts something that sounds like "Raus!" and the doors slide open with a moan that could be a scream. You squint into gray dawn. Snow, smoke, men stumbling. You are no longer a soldier. You are an Italian military internee, a title colder than the wind itself. The irony burns. Months ago, you fought beside these same men, shared rations and cigarettes under the same flag of the Axis. Now, after Italy's armistice, you're their traitor. You've been captured not by enemies, but by yesterday's allies. The paperwork makes sure you feel the difference. A prisoner of war is protected under the Geneva Convention. Letters, pay, inspection, decency. An internee gets none of that. It's as if the law itself decided you no longer exist. You stumble off the train and into a camp that looks carved from despair. Wire fences, wooden huts sagging under snow. Guards wrapped in greatcoats. The sign above the gate doesn't even bother to lie. It just lists a number. No name, no pretense of honor. Inside, the air smells of mold and thin soup. You're handed a crust of bread, black with sawdust, and a spoonful of turnip stew. You eat slowly, half to make it last, half because your stomach's forgotten what food is. Around you shuffle thousands of men who used to be like you, soldiers of Mussolini's armies, now reduced to rags. Some still wear their insignia out of habit, others tore them off in shame. One man hums a tune from Naples, another scratches tally marks into the wall. The sound of coughing fills the barracks like rain. Historians still argue whether Berlin intended to starve you or simply didn't care. It hardly matters to you now. The result feels the same. You wake each day a little lighter, your belt fitting one notch tighter. The Germans give no explanation beyond a single phrase, "Ihr seid Verräter," you are traitors. Every so often, new rumors reach the camp, whispers carried by guards or new arrivals. One week, they say the King of Italy has fled south to join the Allies. Another week, that Mussolini's been rescued by German commandos and installed as puppet leader of a republic up north. You try to decide which rumor is worse. In moments like these, you cling to absurd comforts. A stolen scrap of newspaper, a harmonica made from tin, bread sculptures shaped like saints. You and your bunkmates create tiny rituals to stay sane. Prayers before the watery soup, jokes about the guards, even a mock promotion ceremony for whoever survives the flu. Some guards are cruel for sport. Others are merely bored. You learn their rhythms. The one who sneaks extra cabbage into the stew. The one who beats men for standing too slow. You know which tower to avoid when the moon is bright. A small debate breaks out among prisoners. Are you still soldiers? Or just slaves, waiting for the world to remember you? No one wins the argument. The answer changes with the weather. One morning, you're marched out to work detail. The landscape looks endless, snow and mud, a flat horizon where the cold itself seems alive. You haul bricks, dig ditches, lift stones until your hands split. Those who collapse are carried back in wagons or left where they fall. Statisticians later estimate that roughly 40 out of every 1,000 Italian internees die each year. But numbers never tell you how it feels to watch a friend's breath freeze mid-sentence. And yet, even here, humanity flickers. A German medic treats a frostbitten foot with stolen salve. A French forced laborer sneaks you an apple. A priest whispers absolution through the wall. Small acts of rebellion against a machine built to forget mercy. There's a story, part truth, part legend, about a group of Italian officers who refused to sign loyalty oaths to the German Reich. They were offered better food, warmer quarters, freedom from labor. All they had to do was pledge allegiance to the new fascist Republic of Salo. Out of 40,000, only about 10% agreed. The rest stayed in rags. One officer supposedly said, "I'd rather starve with honor than eat with shame." You wish you'd met that man. Winter crawls into spring, though you barely notice. The mud replaces the snow and the lice replace the cold. Occasionally, you're trucked to new camps: Austria, Poland, Bohemia. The world blurs into barbed wire and factory smoke. You see signs written in languages you don't know. You start forgetting Italian words. Once, during transport, you glimpse civilians watching the convoy pass. A child waves timidly. You wave back, and for a moment, you feel human again. Historians still debate whether the treatment of Italian internees was deliberate vengeance or logistical neglect. The Germans themselves claimed it was discipline for betrayal. But the result was a moral purgatory. Men punished not for fighting, but for surrendering at the wrong moment. A quirky detail emerges decades later. Many Italian internees kept hidden diaries written on scraps of cement bag paper. When discovered after the war, they reveal entries not of rage, but of reflection. One soldier wrote, "The Germans have taken our rifles, our coats, even our names, but not our dreams. Tonight, I dream of pasta." In a strange way, that humor kept you alive. You joke that at least the guards haven't confiscated the weather. By late 1944, the tides of war shift. Rumors spread that the Allies have landed in France, that Rome is free, that Germany is retreating. Hope trickles in, cautious and brittle. Some men dare to think about home again: wives, fields, sunlight. Others don't bother. Hope hurts more than hunger when it fades. One morning, you notice something odd. Fewer guards, less shouting. The work details stop. The next day, Soviet artillery rumbles in the distance. You can't tell if it's salvation or just another army passing through. When liberation finally comes, it's almost anticlimactic. The gates open, but no one rushes out. You're too weak, too uncertain. Freedom feels like a rumor you can't quite believe. The Red Army soldiers who arrive stare at you with pity, then move on. You're not their priority. You're just another ghost in a Europe full of them. Weeks later, Allied officers arrive, promising repatriation. But transport is chaotic, and disease sweeps through the camp. Some of you survive long enough to board the trains home. Others die a few miles from freedom. You, somehow, endure. When you finally reach Italy, the landscape looks unfamiliar. Rubble where towns once stood, vines reclaiming old roads. People stare as you pass, unsure whether to salute or look away. You're thinner, quieter, older than your years. You've learned to measure time not in months or seasons, but in the distance between meals. And when someone asks, "Where were you during the war?" you pause. You want to tell them everything: the cold, the hunger, the laughter in the dark. But you just say, "In Germany." It's easier that way. Later, historians will call you part of a forgotten army. Your story doesn't fit cleanly into victory parades or textbooks. Italy prefers to remember its resistance heroes, not its starved survivors. But history has a long memory, and someday, when someone reads your diary or finds your carved wooden cross in a museum, they'll understand that survival itself was an act of quiet defiance. For now, you sit on a stone wall overlooking your village. The sun warm for the first time in years. The hills are green again. You breathe deeply and think, "I'm still here." It isn't triumph. It isn't absolution. but it's enough. You're still wearing the same uniform, but now it's just fabric. No insignia, no country, no meaning. The war has dragged you eastward, past the frontiers of memory. You're one of the 65,000 Italians swallowed by the Soviet advance after the collapse of the Eastern Front. You don't know it yet, but you've entered the kind of captivity that devours entire years. It starts with the march. You trudge through endless snow, each breath slicing your lungs. The Red Army guards bark orders in a language that sounds like the cracking of ice. You don't hate them. There's no energy left for hate, but you can feel their suspicion. You were an invader once, part of Mussolini's doomed expedition to Russia, and they haven't forgotten the villages burned, the winter corpses left behind. The sun sets at 3 in the afternoon, and when it does, the temperature plunges so fast, it feels like the air itself turns solid. Men stumble out of line and simply vanish into the white. Nobody stops to check if they're alive. The trucks roll on. Historians still argue about the exact death toll of that march. Some say 10,000, others claim twice that, but all agree that few prisoners reach the railheads with boots still intact. You tie your feet in burlap, pray the frostbite takes toes, not legs. After days of walking, you reach a train station. Not a real one, just splintered platforms and cattle cars waiting like open mouths. You're loaded inside, 60 men per car, the doors bolted shut. The floor is already crusted with frozen vomit. You try to sit, but there's no space. Someone whispers the name, Tambov. You'll hear it again for years. The journey lasts weeks. The smell becomes unbearable, a living fog of sickness. Some nights, guards slide open the doors just to toss out the dead. You stop being horrified by it. You just adjust your footing so you don't slip. When the train finally stops, you're in a camp that looks identical to every rumor you've ever heard. Barbed wire, wooden barracks, smoke rising from a single chimney. It's not hell. Hell would at least be warm. Welcome to Soviet captivity. You're given a number, then a shovel, then a sentence that no one bothers to translate. Work, sleep, repeat. At first, the rhythm feels survivable. 8 hours of hauling timber, 2 meals of watery cabbage soup, 1 slice of black bread. But soon, exhaustion becomes its own weather system. Men faint mid-step. The guards rarely shoot. Bullets cost more than starvation. There's an absurd rule about hygiene. Every week, prisoners line up for medical inspection. A Soviet nurse, sometimes a young woman, always wearing rubber gloves, checks for lice and disease. You're embarrassed by the process. She seems indifferent. Historians still note this ritual in archives, the strange collision between Soviet bureaucracy and human misery. To her, you're not a man. You're an inventory item that still breathes. Every so often, a new group of prisoners arrives. Germans, Hungarians, Romanians, even a few Japanese. The guards don't distinguish much between you. The hierarchy of guilt has flattened. You're all just fascists now. But among yourselves, you Italians, still cling to fragments of home. You whisper recipes at night, describe the color of the Mediterranean, trade stories of villages you'll never see again. One man, a former teacher, draws maps in the dirt. Another carves tiny crucifixes from matchsticks. You start to believe that art is a form of defiance, that if you can still imagine beauty, you haven't been conquered. A quirky detail emerges years later in survivor accounts. Italian prisoners in Tambov organized an orchestra. The instruments were crude, a violin made from scrap wood, a drum from an old bucket, but the music lifted spirits. Sometimes, even the guards stopped to listen. For a few minutes, everyone pretended to be human. Winter blends into another. You lose track of time. Men die quietly in their bunks, bodies carried out at dawn. The living take their clothes before the guards notice. You stop feeling shame about it. Survival has no etiquette. You learn tricks. How to chew frozen potatoes without cracking your teeth. How to fake work when the foreman isn't looking. how to wrap your hands in newspaper to hold heat. You learn Russian words, chleb for bread, voda for water, domoy for home. That last one you whisper like a prayer. Historians still debate whether the Soviets intended these camps as punishment or reparation. Officially, you're helping rebuild the motherland. In practice, you're rebuilding it one grave at a time. By 1946, the war is long over, but you're still here. The guards tell you soon, always soon. Some believe them, others stop caring. You carve calendars into the bunkwood, year after year, until there's no space left. Occasionally, a Red Army officer visits and delivers propaganda lectures about communism, equality, the future. You listen politely. You'd agree to almost anything if it meant getting home. When the first group of Italians is finally released, it feels like myth. They march out wearing rags and hollow faces. Those who stay behind cheer anyway. Proof that freedom isn't extinct. You try not to count how many never left. Official Soviet records claim about 20,000 Italians returned home. That means more than 40,000 didn't. You remember their names, or try to. Some you can't. They've already blurred into the snow. Then one morning, your name is called. You almost don't recognize it. The accent is wrong, the syllables butchered, but it's yours. You board a train heading west. No one sings. The guards aren't cruel anymore, just tired. You pass through forests, plains, then cities whose names you can't read. Every mile feels both closer and farther from home. When the train crosses into Hungary, you start to cry. Not from joy, from confusion. You've forgotten what joy feels like. The journey takes weeks. When you finally see the Alps again, they look like ghosts. At the border, Allied officials greet you, offer cigarettes, even coffee. You sip it and nearly choke. It's too rich, too real. In Italy, you step onto the platform at Udine. The air smells of damp stone and wood smoke. Crowds cheer, but you hardly hear them. You're looking for one face, any familiar face, but the crowd is full of strangers. Your mother died last winter, someone says. Your house was shelled, but the olive tree still stands. You nod as if those two facts cancel each other out. You're taken to a hospital for recovery, though the nurses seem more like anthropologists studying extinction. They weigh you, photograph you, take notes on your scars. They say the world must learn. You wonder if it will. In the years that follow, your story fades into statistics. The newspapers write about Reconstruction, the Marshall Plan, new beginnings. There's little space for the men who spent their best years behind Soviet fences. Some call you heroes, others call you fools. Most just forget. But you remember everything. You remember the night when a guard shared his cigarette in silence. You remember the man who saved half his bread for a friend who wouldn't wake. You remember the orchestra, the frozen sunrise, the sound of snow cracking under your boots. And sometimes, when you sit alone at dusk, you think about the men who never came home, the ones who disappeared into Siberian fog and never re-emerged. Historians still argue about their fate, whether they were buried in mass graves or simply lost in paperwork. You don't argue, you just know they're still out there somewhere, frozen mid-step, marching through eternity. You close your eyes and whisper a prayer, not for victory, but for memory, because forgetting would be worse than dying. The war has ended on paper, but not in the streets. You're finally home, if this shell of a country can still be called that. The trains dump you and other returning soldiers into stations filled with rubble, beggars, and graffiti that reads Viva il Duce, right next to Morte ai fascisti. You realize Italy itself doesn't know who it is anymore. You limp through the crowd, clutching a duffel bag that holds everything you own: a Soviet blanket, a tin cup, and a letter you never got to send. The familiar hills rise beyond the station, but they look older, wearier. Children dart through alleys barefoot. The baker's shop is gone, the church steeple half shattered. A man on the corner sells black market cigarettes and claims they're American. You buy one anyway, just to feel modern. It's 1945, and your homecoming isn't triumph, it's confusion. You're one of thousands of Italians returning from captivity in Germany or the East, expecting parades or at least a handshake. Instead, you find suspicion. Where were you? People ask. Which side were you on? The question has no safe answer. You learn quickly to keep your mouth shut. In the first months after liberation, Italy is a country of whispered accusations and invisible tribunals. The royalists cling to legitimacy. The partisans demand revenge. The fascists melt into shadows. Every town has its own rules now. Historians still argue whether this chaos was justice or vengeance. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in the smoke. In Rome, General Pietro Badoglio's government promises order but delivers bureaucracy. Fascist officials are quietly reabsorbed into ministries. A few undergo purification trials that rarely lead to prison. On paper, the purge of fascism looks sweeping. In practice, it's selective, convenient. Italy needs administrators after all. Teachers, police, engineers. So the same men who once enforced Mussolini's decrees now sign forms for the new republic. The slogans on the walls change. The faces behind desks don't. Meanwhile, in the north, the violence refuses to end. Partisans roam the countryside, dragging suspected collaborators from their homes. Some are tried, most are shot. Women accused of sleeping with Germans have their heads shaved in public squares. The newspapers call it spontaneous justice. You call it exhaustion, wearing a new uniform. You pass through one of those towns on your way home. The smell of gunpowder and rot lingers in the air. A body hangs from a lamppost. A local mayor, someone says, who stayed loyal to the Republic of Salo. People stare, but don't intervene. You realize the war has simply changed clothes. That night, you stay with a cousin who fought with the partisans. He eyes your worn uniform and says, "You're lucky they didn't shoot you on sight." You try to laugh, but it doesn't come out right. Italy is splintered between victors who can't afford to celebrate and survivors who can't explain how they survived. Prisons overflow with fascist officials awaiting trial. The guards don't know what to do with them, and corruption does the rest. Bribes open doors faster than keys. Within months, hundreds of accused collaborators simply escape. Others vanish into new government jobs under new names. Historians still debate whether this was amnesty or amnesia. The turning point comes in June 1946, when the newly crowned government issues a general amnesty under Justice Minister Palmiro Togliatti. It's a sweeping gesture meant to heal the nation or bury its guilt. Overnight, thousands of fascists, collaborators, and war criminals walk free. The official reasoning? National reconciliation. The unofficial one? Political survival. Italy's new republic can't afford endless vengeance. The country needs workers, voters, unity. You read the news in disbelief. Men who once shouted oaths to Hitler now stroll to piazza again, tipping their hats as if nothing happened. A few apologize. Most don't. You hear one say, "We all suffered." You clench your fists. You know that's true, and also that it's not. You visit an old friend who fought in the resistance. He tells you he doesn't trust this new republic of forgiveness. They're washing history, he says, and calling it clean. He isn't wrong. Yet amid the bitterness, there are quieter stories. A group of returned prisoners, former Italian military internees, gather each week in Milan to share memories, songs, and soup. They call themselves Gli Invisibili, the invisible ones. No medals, no parades, just men trying to stitch their sanity together. They record testimonies for their children, though most newspapers ignore them. One editor even tells them, the public doesn't want sad stories. Still, they persist. You join them once. Sitting in a smoky room above a cafe, you hear a dozen accents: Sicilian, Venetian, Roman, fused by shared hunger. One man passes around a photo of his barracks mates from Germany. Half are crossed out with pencil. Another reads from a notebook he kept hidden during captivity. His handwriting trembles, but his voice doesn't. The snow didn't kill us. Forgetting would. You nod, because that's what frightens you most. Not what happened, but how quickly people want to move on. Outside, Italy is already reinventing itself. American jeeps patrol the streets. Posters for Coca-Cola appear next to flyers for the first elections. The Marshall Plan dollars start to flow, rebuilding roads faster than anyone can grieve. Everyone wants to talk about the future. You, though, are stuck between guilt and gratitude. One day you receive a letter from a British farmer, the one whose fields you worked during captivity. He writes, "My wife still speaks of your singing." Enclosed is a photograph of the small chapel you helped build, now freshly painted. For a moment you smile. It's strange how kindness from afar can feel more real than peace at home. But politics soon claims even memory. Left-wing newspapers publish stories of German brutality to paint communism as the true anti-fascist force. Right-wing papers highlight Soviet cruelty toward Italian POWs to prove communism's hypocrisy. Your suffering becomes a rhetorical tool, traded like currency in parliament debates. Historians later note that this memory war shaped Italy's post-war identity. Each side weaponized trauma for legitimacy. The truth, the messy, human truth, wasn't useful to anyone. You drift through the late 1940s like a ghost. You take odd jobs, dig ditches, rebuild a bridge, fix roofs. When people ask what you did during the war, you say, "I waited." The country changes fast. New parties rise, old alliances fade. The monarchy collapses, replaced by a republic that promises justice but delivers compromise. The Americans arrive not as liberators now, but as investors. Neon lights replace air raid sirens. And somewhere beneath it all, that quiet shame lingers. Every evening, you walk past a wall where someone scrawled in chalk, "Siamo tutti colpevoli." We are all guilty. The rain keeps washing it away, but someone always rewrites it. A quirky bit of local folklore emerges around this time. Villagers claim that the bells in certain churches ring differently now because they were recast using melted down shell casings. They say the sound is softer, almost mournful. You listen one Sunday morning and think, yes, even the metal remembers. Historians still argue whether Italy truly faced its past or merely folded it under the carpet of reconstruction. Maybe both. You see children playing in bombed-out courtyards, laughing among ruins. Maybe that's what forgiveness looks like. Unintentional, born from ignorance. Years later, in 1950, you'll hear that a national monument has been proposed for the Italian military internees. It takes decades to build, decades more to be acknowledged. But by then, most of your comrades are gone, their names etched on plaques that no one visits. For now, you simply live. You plant tomatoes, you mend a fence, you learn to enjoy silence again. And sometimes, when evening light hits the hills just right, you almost believe the country has healed. But deep down, you know it hasn't. Not completely. The wounds are buried, not closed. The amnesty may have spared the guilty, but it also silenced the broken. Still, you whisper a small prayer for everyone. The men who fought, the ones who surrendered, the ones who disappeared into Siberian snow. Because if Italy has taught you anything, it's that survival isn't the opposite of guilt. It's just the next step after it. You wake to the sound of boots on gravel. Again. But this time, they're not German. They're American, British, and Soviet, moving across a ruined continent that has finally gone silent. It's May 1945. Germany has surrendered, and you, a soldier of the Reich, stand in the ruins of what was once the most powerful army in the world. The surrender is anticlimactic. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just a slow, collective exhale of defeat. The Wehrmacht's banners have been shredded or burned. Commanders whisper that it's over, but no one really understands what over means. You're ordered to throw down your rifle. You hesitate for a second. Not because of loyalty to Hitler, no one speaks his name anymore, but because it feels like you're dropping the last piece of yourself that still has a purpose. The metal clatters on the cobblestones. The sound echoes longer than it should. You're one of 11 million German soldiers captured across Europe. The war ended, but for you and millions like you, it's the beginning of another kind of captivity. The difference now is geography. 8 million of you fall into Western Allied hands, the Americans, the British, the French. The other 3 million? The Soviets. And in 1945, that difference might as well be life or death. You don't know yet where you'll end up. The roads are clogged with columns of surrendering troops, all heading west, desperate to reach the Americans before the Red Army does. There's a phrase whispered among soldiers: better a year with the Yankees than a day with the Ivans. Historians still debate whether that panic was justified. The numbers say yes, German mortality in Soviet captivity was nearly 1 in 3. But no statistic can capture the smell of burning tanks, the empty faces of civilians in Dresden, or the moment you realize your uniform now brands you not as a warrior, but as a criminal. You and your unit are disarmed near Hanover. American trucks line the roads, their white stars gleaming through the dust. You expect hostility, maybe gunfire. Instead, the Americans look bored. They wave you toward a makeshift enclosure, barbed wire stretched across a muddy field. You join thousands of others, sitting in silence under a sky that suddenly feels enormous. There are no barracks, no tents, just open air. The guards hand out tin cups of water and packets of powdered rations. It's not cruelty, it's logistics. There are simply too many of you to feed properly. Someone jokes, "At least the war's over." No one laughs. The Americans call it a temporary holding area, but it grows larger every day. Eventually, the newspapers back home will call them Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow Camps. The official line says conditions were adequate. Survivors later call them purgatory. The days blur. You dig latrines, stand for roll call, stare at the horizon. Rain turns the ground to sludge. Sun bakes it into concrete. There's little food, less dignity, and no news. The guards say nothing about when you'll be released. One night, lightning splits the sky, and for a brief moment, you see the wire gleam like silver thread. You think about home, whatever's left of it. Historians still argue whether the Americans intentionally neglected prisoners or were simply overwhelmed. General Eisenhower classified the captured Germans as disarmed enemy forces instead of prisoners of war, a semantic trick that stripped you of Geneva protections. The irony isn't lost on you. Germany broke every rule of war, and now you're paying the bill. After a few weeks, you're moved again, this time to France. You expected liberation to look different. Instead, you're handed to a new set of guards who don't speak your language and don't hide their hatred. To them, you're not just a soldier, you're vengeance made flesh. France is starving, and you're free labor. They send you to clear rubble in a bombed-out city. Every swing of the shovel feels like penance. Civilians spit near your feet. You don't blame them, you just keep working. And then comes the worst task: mine clearing. The Allies need fields cleared, roads opened, coastlines made safe again. Who better to do it, they decide, than the men who planted the mines in the first place? The French call it justice through labor. You call it gambling with your life. Each morning, you walk into the fields with a metal detector, or sometimes just a stick, and hope the next click isn't your last. You learn to move slowly, breathe shallow, never think about the odds. One day, the man beside you disappears in a flash of dirt and noise. The guards don't even flinch. They mark the crater, take a note, and send another man forward. 2,000 of you die each month in this macabre cleanup. It's not war anymore, but it's not peace either. At night, you sit by a fire with what's left of your unit. Someone hums a song, Lily Marlene. You all join in quietly. The guards listen, but don't stop you. Even enemies need lullabies. The French officers say the work is voluntary. You don't argue. Hunger is the best recruiter. Meanwhile, rumors spread. In the east, the Soviets are shipping prisoners to Siberia, building cities from bones. You're lucky, you remind yourself. Lucky to still have fingers, lungs, breath. Still, you count the days. Months pass. You're transferred again, this time to Belgium, then to Luxembourg. The work is the same. Roads, mines, ruins. The pay is symbolic. 2 shillings a day if you're in British custody. Less if you're French. You hoard the coins anyway. A reminder that value still exists. Then, one morning in 1946, an officer calls your name. You're being released. You almost don't believe it until they hand you papers stamped repatriation approved. You read the date 3 times to be sure. The war began for you in 1939. It's now 7 years later. The train home moves through landscapes that look familiar, yet wrong. Towns flattened, fields barren, forests stripped for fuel. In Cologne, you pass the cathedral, still standing amid miles of rubble. Someone in your carriage starts crying. When you step off at last, the platform smells of coal and dust. Children play in bombed-out shells, collecting spent casings like toys. You see your reflection in a shattered window, gaunt, gray, eyes hollowed by too much waiting. Your mother is gone, your father too. But a neighbor recognizes you. She says, "You came back." You nod, though you're not sure what that means anymore. Historians later note that only a few hundred Germans died in captivity on US soil. Out of millions. The Americans were strict, but not cruel. The British put you to work rebuilding their farms, their bridges. You don't begrudge them. You tell yourself, labor is better than guilt. But the French camps left a scar, one the government would take decades to acknowledge. You learn that West Germany's new leaders are already talking about reconstruction, about democracy, about moving forward. You want to believe them. You want to forget the wire, the mud, the mines. But every time you close your eyes, you see that field again, the one that still holds your friend beneath it. A strange, almost comic detail surfaces later. Some POWs returning from France bring home pet cats they befriended in the camps. One even writes to his former French guard, thanking him for the milk he once shared. Life, it seems, finds small loopholes in tragedy. Historians still argue whether the Western Allies did the right thing, balancing justice with humanity. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. You only know that cruelty wears many flags, and mercy does too. By winter 1946, you find work clearing rubble in your own city. The same labor you once did under guard, now called rebuilding. It's strange how different it feels when you choose to do it. Each day, as you lift another brick, you whisper a small prayer. Not for Germany, not for the dead, but for the living who have to carry all this memory forward. You wonder if history will remember you as the villain, the victim, or something in between. Then you realize it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're still here, hands raw, heart beating, trying to build something solid out of all this dust. You wake up to birdsong, the kind you almost forgot existed. For the first time in years, no one's shouting orders. The war is over, and you're alive, but not free, not really. You're still in a British camp, somewhere in Norfolk, England. The fences are neat, the food warm, the guards polite. You might almost call it civilized, if not for the small matter of being a prisoner. The difference between this and the hell of 1945 France feels like waking from a nightmare into a dull gray morning. The British don't hate you, they just need you. You're given a shovel, or sometimes a hammer, and sent out to rebuild what the Luftwaffe destroyed. One day it's repairing roads, another day harvesting potatoes on a chilly estate farm. The work is endless, but measured, 8-hour days, hot tea breaks, sometimes even music on the radio. You've traded terror for tedium, and that's not such a bad bargain. The British follow the Geneva Convention to the letter, though sometimes with a dry sense of humor. Your daily pay is 2 shillings, less than a British laborer earns, but more than you expected. Earn your keep, the sergeant says. We all are. Some nights, the guards forget to lock the gates. No one escapes. Where would you go? The locals recognize the PW badge sewn to your jacket. They just hand you back with a cup of tea and a lecture. Still, there's dignity here. You sleep in real beds, receive mail, and can even attend church. Some of you volunteer for English lessons, hoping that words might rebuild bridges faster than treaties. You learn phrases like make do and carry on, which seem to describe the entire British soul. One of the strangest sensations is safety. You can walk to work unarmed, unafraid, and yet the quiet unnerves you. It's like listening for gunfire that never comes. Historians still argue whether British leniency came from morality or pragmatism. After all, someone had to clear the debris and harvest the crops. Post-war Britain was broke, its men still demobilizing. You, the former enemy, became a solution with hands attached. There's a small controversy in Parliament over using German laborers on public works, but it fades quickly. The war's over, people say. Let them dig. It's not all civility, of course. The newspapers occasionally run stories about Nazi prisoners dancing at camp socials, which spark outrage from families who lost sons. You can't blame them. You don't dance. You don't even hum anymore. But the rumors persist. A quirky fact: some British civilians begin inviting prisoners to Sunday service or holiday meals. The Red Cross encourages it as part of re-education. You find yourself sitting at a dinner table with an English family, eating roast lamb. They ask polite questions about Germany. You answer in broken English, avoiding politics. The children stare at your uniform, then offer you candy. It tastes like forgiveness. Too sweet, a little unreal. You write letters home, but the mail moves slower than memory. Months pass before replies arrive. Ink faded, words hesitant. We are alive. Come when you can. One morning, the camp commandant posts a notice. Prisoners may volunteer for civilian labor. It's the same work, just without guards. You sign up immediately. The uniform changes, no more PW patch, but the past stays stitched under your skin. You're sent to a small village in Yorkshire, billeted in a barn behind a farm. The farmer's wife brings you soup. Her husband nods gruffly, but never speaks. After a week, he finally does, asking if you know how to fix a tractor. You do. That night, he hands you a pint of ale. The silence between you begins to thaw. Historians note that hundreds of German POWs integrated quietly into British rural life long before repatriation. Some married local women, built homes, stayed for good. Decades later, their children would grow up with Yorkshire accents and German surnames. You don't know that yet, but you're living the first page of that quiet story. Every so often, the radio carries news from home. Berlin divided, trials in Nuremberg, the word denazification buzzing like a swarm of flies. You listen, but feel detached. The Reich is gone. The uniforms, the salutes, the certainty. It all feels like something that happened to someone else. But you're not naive. You know the crimes, the rumors, the camps. You've heard whispers in your own ranks, long before defeat. You think about it at night, what your army did in Poland, in Russia, in France. The atrocities weren't secrets. They were habits. Historians still argue how much the average soldier knew. You think the real question is how much they wanted to know. Your camp chaplain, a soft-spoken Anglican, holds evening talks about conscience. He never says Nazis. He just says men who forgot they were men. You sit in the back, staring at your boots, unsure whether the lesson applies to you. Then one day, you hear that some prisoners are being released early. The Allies have decided to send home low-risk POWs, farmers, laborers, those with clean records. You line up for the interview. The officer asks if you were in the SS. You shake your head. He checks your file, stamps cleared, and moves on. It feels anticlimactic. Freedom is a rubber stamp. You expect to leave within weeks, but months turn into a year. Bureaucracy moves slower than grief. In the meantime, the camp's fences come down. Civilians visit freely. You help rebuild a school nearby, mixing mortar under an English sky that feels too open after years of wire. A teacher thanks you in halting German. "We all lost something," she says. You nod, though you don't know what to reply. Another quirky truth. When Christmas arrives, the village invites your entire camp to the church pageant. You play a shepherd because you look the part. Children giggle as you stand there in borrowed robes, holding a wooden crook. You sing Silent Night in German while the English sing in their own tongue. And for the first time, the words don't feel like enemies. By 1947, rumors of repatriation swirl again. Some men are sent to France to work off war reparations, others to Canada for logging. You secretly hope for America. You hear they treat prisoners well, even give them jobs, but your papers say return to Germany. Before you go, the farmer's wife gives you a photograph, a picture of their family and the dog you always fed scraps to. She says, "You helped us more than you know." You want to tell her the same, but the words don't exist in English or German. You just bow your head and whisper, Danke. Historians later point out that fewer than 500 Germans died in British captivity, a number so low it almost seems miraculous. But the truth is simpler. The British saw you not as monsters, but as tools for rebuilding. Work humanized you. Labor, not ideology, became your atonement. When you finally board the ship back to Germany, the sea smells like rust and salt. The wind bites, but it's a clean kind of cold. You stand on deck with hundreds of others, watching England fade into mist. Some cheer, you don't. You just feel the strange ache of leaving a place that never meant to be home, but somehow became one. The ship docks at Hamburg, a city you barely recognize. Charred skeletons of buildings, cranes rising over ash. The station where you once marched off to war now lies in ruins. You're processed, given a ration card, and told, "Welcome home." It's a hollow phrase. You walk through streets full of hollow men, other veterans, refugees, widows selling trinkets for bread. The air smells of coal smoke and surrender. But amid the rubble, life stirs. Children play with toys made from shell casings. A woman hangs laundry between the walls of a collapsed house. A violinist plays in a doorway. And for the first time in years, you don't feel like a prisoner. Historians still argue about the morality of post-war captivity, whether justice was served, whether mercy was earned. You stop caring about the arguments. You just keep walking, boots crunching through debris, toward whatever passes for tomorrow. Because if the war taught you anything, it's this. Survival isn't a medal. It's a question you answer every single day. You never thought you'd miss the wire. At least in the camps, you knew where you stood. Inside or out, alive or dead. But the Soviets, they blur those lines until even time forgets to keep count. You're one of the 3 million Germans who never reached the West in 1945. Instead, you were swallowed by the eastward tide of the Red Army, herded into trucks, then trains, then something far worse. The silence afterward. When the doors open, it isn't freedom, it's Siberia. You've read about it in leaflets, the endless white, the labor camps, the cold that kills faster than bullets. The reality is worse, because it doesn't hate you, it just doesn't care. You're assigned to a lumber camp near the Volga, a name you can't pronounce. The guards call it corrective labor. You call it life on pause. There's no trial, no sentence, no explanation, just work. And work here means survival, measured in wheelbarrows. You cut trees 12 hours a day. The axes are dull, your gloves long since stolen by frost. Every swing feels like your bones are splintering. When your hands crack and bleed, you suck on the wounds to keep them warm. Food arrives as soup that tastes of boiled wallpaper. Bread is currency. Bread is life. You hide half your ration under your mattress, even though the rats know the same trick. The Soviets are not monsters. They're bureaucrats. They don't need to kill you. They just let the system do it for them. Historians still debate the true number of Germans who died in Soviet captivity. Some say 1.1 million. Others say more. But numbers can't tell you how cold feels when it stops being a temperature and starts being a sound. The crack of joints, the crunch of snow under a man too weak to stand. The camp is a small city of ghosts. Germans, Hungarians, Romanians, Finns, even Japanese from Manchuria. The guards call you all fascists, but to each other, you're just men. You share cigarettes rolled from newspaper and whisper stories about home. Someone remembers the taste of real coffee. Another remembers his wife's perfume. You close your eyes and imagine both. There's a rumor of amnesty coming, whispered like a fairy tale. Stalin will release the prisoners soon. The rumor has been coming soon for 2 years. One morning, the guards line everyone up. You expect punishment, maybe transfer. Instead, a truck arrives with boxes of books. Russian classics. Tolstoy, Gorky, even Marx. The camp commandant announces education sessions. You laugh until you realize he's serious. Each week, you sit in a freezing barrack listening to a commissar read passages about human progress. You wonder if he sees the irony, but you attend anyway. It's warm inside, and they give you extra soup. Historians still argue whether the Soviet re-education program for POWs was sincere or propaganda. The truth, you think, doesn't matter. It was something to do besides die. A quirky, almost unbelievable fact emerges decades later. Some prisoners actually fell in love during captivity. Nurses, translators, even guards, women who saw the same emptiness in your eyes and recognized their own. One German prisoner married his Russian nurse after release. They raised children who spoke both languages but trusted neither. Back in your camp, affection is rarer than bread, but kindness still flickers. A guard slips you a potato once. You don't thank him, you just nod. Gratitude feels dangerous. Years pass, or maybe it's just one long season that never ends. You stop marking time. Men vanish into illness, exhaustion, despair. You learn to spot the look in their eyes, the moment before someone gives up. When it comes, you force them to eat, to move, to curse, anything to keep the soul tethered. And then, miraculously, 1949 arrives. Stalin decrees a wave of repatriations. You don't believe it until you see the trucks. The Soviets line you up again, read out names. When they reach yours, your knees nearly buckle. The train westward crawls through the same landscapes that once swallowed you. Villages rebuilt from ashes, forests regrown where battlefields once stood. The world seems to have moved on without you. You arrive in Berlin, but not the one you remember. The city is split now. American, British, French, Soviet sectors, dividing it like a broken plate glued together badly. You don't know which side you're on, or whether it matters. The Red Cross takes your photo. They call you a repatriated worker. The word soldier has disappeared. You learn that most returning POWs face suspicion at home. West Germans whisper that you might be turned, that the Soviets brainwashed you. East Germans assume you're guilty of war crimes. Either way, you're something uncomfortable, living evidence that peace didn't arrive for everyone. Historians still argue about how post-war Germany treated its returning prisoners. Officially, they were victims of circumstance. In practice, they were ghosts who didn't fit the new narrative. The West wanted Reconstruction heroes, not reminders of defeat. The East wanted loyal socialists, not broken men who'd seen the inside of Siberia. You rent a room in the ruins of Dresden. The building has no roof, but someone strung a curtain where the ceiling used to be. The landlady lost her husband at Stalingrad. When you tell her you were in Russia too, she stares for a long moment, then says softly, "Then we both survived the impossible." You find work hauling bricks. Every wall you raise feels like penance and renewal in equal measure. Your hands grow calloused again, this time from creation instead of destruction. But nights are harder. Sometimes you wake screaming from dreams of frost and silence. Other nights you just lie awake wondering whether the men still in the camps are dreaming of you. You visit your mother's grave. The churchyard is quiet, the stone crooked. You whisper the words you've rehearsed for years. I came back. It doesn't sound like victory. It sounds like an apology. The newspapers talk about the Nuremberg trials. Justice, guilt, morality. You follow the headlines but feel detached. Those trials are for leaders, not for men like you. You weren't innocent, but you weren't powerful either. You just obeyed orders until the orders ran out. Historians still debate that phrase, just following orders. It's become a kind of curse, the moral scar of an entire generation. You don't defend it, you just know it's true. And that truth is its own prison. A quirky story circulates in the early 50s. A group of German ex-POWs who stayed in the Soviet Union voluntarily. They'd married, found work, even joined collective farms. The Western press calls them traitors. You just call them tired. Maybe they realized there was nowhere left to go home to. By 1950, you hear that the last major groups of prisoners are finally coming back. You go to the station to watch. The trains look familiar, faces too thin, eyes too old. You stand there, silently, as they step off. Men who left as soldiers and return as warnings. One of them asks, "Is this home?" You don't know how to answer. Historians note that by the early 50s, more than 90% of German POWs in Soviet hands had been released. The rest, those accused of war crimes, would stay much longer. Some until the mid-50s. You keep working, keep breathing, keep pretending that the past is finished. But every so often, you smell snow in the air. And for a heartbeat, you're back there. The camp, the silence, the shovel in your hands. When you finally receive your official certificate of rehabilitation, it feels meaningless. A piece of paper can't erase years of frostbite and hunger, but you tuck it into your wallet anyway, because proof matters. A decade later, when West Germany forms the Bundeswehr, the new national army, recruiters come looking for experienced veterans. You decline. You've worn enough uniforms for one lifetime. Sometimes, though, you pass soldiers drilling in the square, their boots hitting the ground in perfect rhythm, and a strange nostalgia stirs, a ghostly echo of pride. You crush it quickly. The past, you remind yourself, isn't something to miss. Still, you can't help wondering, if the Soviets hadn't captured you, if the war had ended differently, would you have been one of the men standing trial, or one of the ones watching? It's the kind of question you never answer aloud. You just keep walking through the rebuilt streets of Dresden, where children laugh among flowers planted in craters, and think, maybe survival isn't redemption, but it's the closest thing mortals ever get. The year is 1946, and the war has finally stopped echoing, but the noise hasn't. You can still hear it in the clatter of typewriters, in the shuffle of courtrooms, in the low hum of bureaucracy pretending to be justice. Germany, or what's left of it, has traded bombs for paperwork, and you, a returned prisoner, watch as a new kind of trial begins. The Allies call it denazification. The idea sounds simple. Separate the guilty from the innocent, the ideologues from the ordinary. But as you'll soon learn, nothing in post-war Germany is simple. Everyone was involved, and no one was responsible. You receive a questionnaire, 132 questions printed in cramped type. Where did you work? Which organizations were you a member of? Did you ever donate to Nazi charities? Attend rallies? Display portraits of Hitler? You stare at the paper and realize that the truth could ruin you, and a lie could too. Historians still argue whether denazification was moral cleansing or political theater. In practice, it's both. The Americans insist on tribunals and accountability. The British prefer quiet efficiency. The French lean toward reparation labor. And the Soviets, well, they don't bother pretending. Their justice comes with shovels. You're summoned to a local hearing. The judge is younger than you, wearing a crisp uniform that still smells of fresh starch. He glances at your file, then at your face, as though comparing two species. Were you a party member? He asks. You tell him no, though you once paid dues to keep your job. Did you serve the regime? You pause, remembering orders shouted in the dark, trains filled with silence, friends who vanished for asking the wrong questions. I was a soldier, you say. It's the only answer you can give. He nods and stamps Mitläufer, follower, the middle category, neither innocent nor criminal. A perfect German compromise. Outside the hall, others wait their turn. Professors, farmers, widows, even priests. Everyone trying to prove they were only slightly Nazi. The irony isn't lost on anyone. By 1947, the denazification process is collapsing under its own weight. There are too many files, too few judges, and far too much guilt to go around. The Americans realize that if they punish every former Nazi, they'll have no one left to rebuild Germany. So the policy quietly shifts. Pragmatism replaces purity. A quirky bit of historical trivia: entire categories of offenders are reclassified overnight. Sympathizers become necessary participants. Minor offenders become exonerated. It's less about forgiveness than convenience. You start seeing familiar faces again. Former party members now working in post offices, police stations, schools. Men who once shouted slogans now whisper about democracy. It's dizzying how fast the past gets rebranded. Historians still debate whether this was hypocrisy or survival. You stop debating. You just keep your head down and rebuild. But not everyone escapes the paperwork. The major offenders, those with documented crimes, face the Nuremberg trials. You read about them in the papers. Names that once commanded empires, now reduced to defendants in glass boxes. Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop. The broadcasts describe justice for humanity. But to you, it sounds like theater, staged for the cameras. You don't mean that cynically. You just know that no verdict can resurrect the dead. You sit in a cafe one morning, listening to the radio as they announce Goering's suicide. A man at the next table mutters. Even now, they find a way to escape. The others nod. No one raises a glass. There's no satisfaction in it, only exhaustion. And yet, something curious happens. The trials, the confessions, the images of corpses from camps you didn't want to believe existed. They change the air itself. For the first time, you feel the weight of collective guilt settling over Germany like mist, the kind that doesn't sting, but seeps. You realize the world will not forgive easily, nor should it. You walk through the streets of Dresden, past walls still pocked with bullet holes, and notice how people avoid meeting each other's eyes. Everyone's pretending not to remember. A historian later coins the term, the clean Wehrmacht myth. It's the comforting story many veterans tell themselves, that the regular German army fought honorably while the SS committed the crimes. It's a myth that spreads fast because it allows the nation to grieve without self-loathing. You hear it in taverns, in newspapers, even in church sermons. We were soldiers, not monsters, people say. You want to believe them, you almost do, but at night, you see flashes, villages burning in Poland, civilians huddled in ditches. You remember the silence of your superiors, the way everyone looked away. You were there, even if you didn't pull the trigger. Historians still argue whether silence counts as guilt. You decide it does. Yet even guilt dulls with repetition. By the early 1950s, the trials end. The files are archived, and Germany starts focusing on the future. The Marshall Plan money arrives, bringing optimism and refrigerators. The rubble turns to foundations, the ruins to factories. You find work in one of them, tightening bolts for the new world being built atop the ashes of the old. The newspapers call it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. You call it distraction. Still, the rhythm of rebuilding has its mercy. The clang of hammers replaces the sound of bombs. Children laugh again. New music fills the air. Jazz, swing, American optimism. You even buy a suit, though the tailor's hands tremble from memories of the war. Then, one November morning in 1955, the radio announces something that makes you pause mid-breakfast. The founding of the Bundeswehr, Germany's new army. You sit there, staring at the wall. 10 years ago, you swore you'd never wear a uniform again. But part of you, the part still trained to obey, feels a flicker of recognition. A new army, a new Germany. Could it be different this time? Old comrades debate it endlessly. Some enlist again, eager to serve under the new democracy. Others scoff, saying uniforms will always lead to graves. You stay silent. You've seen both sides of discipline, its dignity and its danger. Historians note that by 1956, over half of the Bundeswehr's officers were former Wehrmacht men. Pragmatism again. Experience is a scarce resource, and no one else knows how to run an army. You don't judge them. You just hope they remember what obedience cost. Meanwhile, another process begins. One less formal, but equally important. Memory politics. The country starts deciding how to remember its sins. Films portray ordinary soldiers as victims. Textbooks soften the narrative. Monuments honor the dead, but rarely name the guilty. The government pardons thousands of convicted war criminals by the early 1950s, citing national unity. It's strange, watching history rewrite itself in real time. You feel like you're living in two countries, the one that remembers and the one that refuses. Still, you can't deny progress. Cities glow again, families thrive, bread is plentiful. Maybe amnesia is a price nations pay for peace. A quirky anecdote circulates. A tailor in Hamburg advertises veterans discounts for refitting old uniforms into civilian coats. You laugh the first time you hear it, then realize how perfect the metaphor is. The whole country is tailoring its past, cutting out the stains, stitching over the tears. Historians still debate whether post-war Germany's forgiveness was moral maturity or moral fatigue. You suspect it's both. One evening, you sit with an old comrade over beer. He says, "We were just caught in history's gears." You clink glasses, but don't answer. Because gears don't choose which way they turn. Men do. Years later, when your son asks what you did in the war, you pause. You could tell him the sanitized version, the one where you were brave, unlucky, misunderstood. But you don't. You say, "I survived," and leave it there. He grows up in a country that calls itself new, and maybe it is. But deep down, you know that history doesn't disappear. It just changes uniforms. 10 years after the surrender, the world feels new again. Shiny cars, transistor radios, the smell of coffee that isn't rationed. But beneath the gloss of progress, something older stirs. Germany is rearming. The Bundeswehr, the Federal Defense Force, has been born. You read the announcement in the paper on November 12, 1955, and freeze. The date isn't random. It's chosen deliberately. Clausewitz's birthday, the philosopher of disciplined warfare. The symbolism is unmistakable. A new army rising from the ashes of the old, vowing to be citizens in uniform. You wonder if that promise will hold. At first, the idea of returning to service feels absurd. You're middle-aged now. Your hands still remember the cold of Soviet labor camps. Your back aches in the rain. But then a letter arrives, an invitation, not an order. It's from a former officer, now recruiting for the new army. "We need experienced men," he writes. "Men who understand both obedience and its cost." You stare at the page for a long time. The phrasing haunts you. Historians still argue whether the Bundeswehr's founders were visionaries or pragmatists. Some say it was a moral necessity, a way for West Germany to protect itself amid the new Cold War. Others call it a quiet rehabilitation of the Wehrmacht's soul, a polite rewriting of history under NATO's watchful eye. You attend an information meeting out of curiosity. The hall smells of chalk and new paint. Posters display slogans like "Defend freedom, serve peace." The uniforms look cleaner, simpler, stripped of old insignia. There are no swastikas now, no imperial eagles, no Führer portraits, just the black-red-gold flag of democracy fluttering behind the podium. A young officer speaks. He can't be more than 30. He says the Bundeswehr will be different. No blind obedience, no political worship, Soldiers will swear allegiance not to a man, but to the Constitution. You will have a duty to resist unlawful orders, he says. The room murmurs. It's a radical idea in a country where orders once meant survival. You realize that in some twisted way, the new army is trying to redeem the old one. But redemption is a fragile thing. You talk afterward with a few of the men in attendance. Most are like you, former Wehrmacht soldiers, older, cautious. One admits he still wakes at night from dreams of Stalingrad. Another says he just wants a steady job and a pension. None of you mention ideology. The word feels radioactive. Historians later note that the Bundeswehr became a strange mixture. Old soldiers carrying the scars of totalitarianism, young recruits raised in democracy, and American advisors trying to balance both. It's a miracle it worked at all. You decide not to join. You tell yourself it's because you've seen enough uniforms, but part of you knows the real reason. You don't trust yourself. You followed orders before, too well. Still, you watch from the sidelines as the new institution grows. The Bundeswehr adopts modern codes, ethical training, civilian oversight, strict parliamentary control. They call it Innere Führung, leadership from within. A philosophy meant to ensure no soldier ever becomes a cog again. It sounds noble. It also sounds like wishful thinking. A quirky story circulates that year. A group of American officers visiting Germany for NATO coordination insist that the new army should march differently, less rigidly, to distance itself from its goose-stepping past. The German drill instructors comply, reluctantly. Old habits die slower than nations. The newspapers print smiling photos of Chancellor Adenauer inspecting recruits. The captions say, "Germany stands for peace." You clip one and paste it in your notebook, right beside a yellowed photograph of yourself from 1942. Two Germanys staring at each other, neither innocent. Meanwhile, the Cold War deepens. The Soviet Union builds its own bloc. East Germany raises an army too, the Nationale Volksarmee. You look at the pictures, same faces, same accents, opposite flags. It feels like your own reflection wearing a different uniform. Historians still debate whether this remilitarization was inevitable. The truth is simpler. Europe was terrified, and fear always hires soldiers. In your town, a new base opens. The young Bundeswehr men look almost carefree. Clean boots, crisp smiles, American cigarettes tucked behind their ears. They wave when they see you on the street. Some call you Opa, grandfather. It's meant kindly, but it stings. You envy their ignorance, their ability to wear a uniform without hearing ghosts in every drumbeat. Still, you can't help feeling proud when you see the German flag flying again. Not the old one, but something reborn. Maybe this time, it will stand for dignity instead of dominance. Then come the veterans' debates. Old comrades gather in beer halls, arguing over whether the Bundeswehr betrayed the old codes of honor or finally fulfilled them. Some call the new army a puppet of the Americans. Others call it our second chance. You mostly listen. The beer tastes better when you don't talk. Historians note that these arguments, half nostalgia, half guilt, became part of Germany's national therapy. The country was learning to discuss its past without exploding from it. You receive another letter, this one from your son. He's 20 now and has joined the Bundeswehr as a radio operator. You sit at the table, letter trembling in your hands. His words are full of optimism, discipline, duty, service. You hear yourself in his tone, and it terrifies you. When he visits home in uniform, you study him quietly. The cut of the jacket is new, but the way he stands, straight, proud, feels ancient. "We're not like you were," he says, sensing your unease. "We're trained to think for ourselves." You nod, hoping it's true. Still, that night, you dream of boots on frozen ground and wake in a cold sweat. Historians still argue about the psychological weight carried by your generation. The veterans who lived long enough to see their children don the same uniform under a different flag. You call it poetic irony. In 1957, the Bundeswehr sends troops abroad for joint NATO exercises. The newspapers call it a triumph of trust. Other countries, France, Britain, even the United States, salute Germany's return to responsible strength. You read the headline and think how quickly the world forgets. But maybe forgetting is mercy. A quirky anecdote from that year makes you smile. A group of West German soldiers visiting Norway are mistaken for British by the locals because of their modern helmets and soft accents. At last, one paper jokes, our army has learned to blend in. By the early 1960s, your son writes that he's stationed near the inner German border. He describes standing guard while East German soldiers watch from across the fence. Sometimes they wave, sometimes they just stare. It's strange, he writes, protecting a country from our own reflection. You realize that's the perfect metaphor for modern Germany, guarding itself against what it used to be. Historians later describe this period as moral stabilization. The Bundeswehr becomes one of Europe's most trusted institutions, not because of its power, but because of its restraint. Every salute carries a whisper of self-awareness. Every parade feels like an apology. When your son is promoted, you attend the ceremony. The brass band plays, the flag ripples, and for a fleeting moment you feel something close to peace. Not pride exactly, but reconciliation. The thought that maybe the uniform wasn't cursed after all. Afterward, he thanks you for coming. I know you hate the past, he says, but I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for what you taught me. You want to argue, to tell him you taught him nothing but mistakes. Instead, you just hug him and whisper, then do it better. As the years pass, you see fewer veterans wearing medals in public. The war generation fades, replaced by men and women who only know ruins from photographs. And that's how it should be. History, after all, isn't meant to stay alive. It's meant to teach, then rest. Historians still debate whether the Bundeswehr redeemed Germany's military soul or merely disguised it. You suspect it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that your son's uniform represents something the old one never could: humility. On your last visit to the barracks, you notice a plaque near the entrance. It reads, "Never again shall obedience excuse injustice." You stand there a long time, running your fingers over the words. It feels like an epitaph, not for soldiers, but for blindness. And as you walk away, the sound of marching boots fades behind you, replaced by laughter. The light, careless laughter of young men who don't yet know what history can cost. You smile faintly, maybe that's the point. The war ends differently for Japan. No grand surrender parade, no jubilant liberation, just a voice on the radio that sounds too calm to be real. The emperor speaks, his tone clipped and formal, saying words no Japanese citizen has ever heard before. We must endure the unendurable. You are one of the millions listening in disbelief. The empire that once spanned half the Pacific has fallen. The divine wind has failed. And the soldiers who fought for it, men like you, are suddenly ghosts in their own country. You stand in a crowd in Tokyo, surrounded by silence more suffocating than any air raid. The sky above is clear, the kind of blue that mocks you. You survived bombs, firestorms, hunger, and for what? When the Americans arrive, it's not with the fury you expected. They come in orderly lines, their boots too clean for the rubble they march through. They bring food, medicine, rules. The flags change, the uniforms change, and life keeps moving as if nothing sacred ever burned. Historians still debate whether Japan's surrender was purely military necessity or moral revelation. For you, it's simpler. You lost because you ran out of everything: bullets, faith, friends. Your discharge papers are stamped demobilized. No one calls you a hero. You queue at a government office to trade your uniform for a ration card. It's a humiliating ritual repeated by millions. You hand over your sword, once your soul, and receive in exchange a stack of coupons for rice and soap. The occupation authorities insist on calling this reintegration. You call it penance. Returning home, isn't much different from returning to an alien planet. Your village has changed beyond recognition. The wooden houses are gone, replaced by blackened foundations. Your family survived, barely, but they look at you like they don't know who you are. You catch your reflection in a cracked mirror and understand why. Your eyes have the same emptiness as the ruins around you. The government tells you to rebuild, to forget, to become useful citizens again. You try. You take whatever work you can find, unloading freight, digging ditches, hauling bricks. The same hands that once held a rifle now hold a shovel. It's honest labor, but every strike of the spade feels like atonement. Historians note that the US-led occupation moved quickly to disarm and demobilize Japan's soldiers, nearly 7 million of them by the end of 1946. Unlike Germany, there were no mass trials for ordinary troops. The Americans chose practicality over punishment. The war was over. Japan needed to rebuild. Still, the shame lingers like ash. When you meet other veterans, the conversations are quiet, careful. You speak in half sentences. No one brags about their service. You avoid eye contact with civilians, especially the widows. You can tell by their stares that they blame you, not the generals, for the sons who never came back. A quirky fact. In 1946, a Tokyo newspaper ran a classified ad section filled entirely with veterans looking for lost comrades. Seeking Sergeant K of 2nd Division, last seen near Lady. To anyone who knew Private Nakamura, write to Osaka Post Number 3. It read like an obituary written by the living. You wonder sometimes what happened to those names. Meanwhile, the Americans flood the country with new ideas, democracy, consumer goods, baseball. They rewrite the Constitution, banning war forever. You listen to the radio as politicians debate it, and part of you feels relief. The other part feels amputated. A nation without a sword. Is that still Japan? Historians still argue whether the post-war Constitution was liberation or occupation in disguise. You stop arguing. You just work, eat, sleep, repeat. Routine becomes your new armor, but the hardest battle is the one inside your head. At night, you dream of the jungle, the buzzing insects, the rain that never stops, the smell of rotting uniforms. You see your comrades again, the ones who never left the Philippines. Some starved, some surrendered, some simply vanished. You wake drenched in sweat, clutching your blanket as if it were a rifle. You hear stories of soldiers who never got the message that the war had ended. Men still hiding in island jungles, living on fruit and memory. They become legends, proof that loyalty outlived logic. One of them, Hiro Onoda, will keep fighting until 1974, refusing to believe surrender was real. You envy his certainty, even if it's madness. A few years after the surrender, you finally receive your back pay, wages accumulated during service. You expect it to feel like justice. Instead, it feels like a bribe to forget. The money buys a futon, some decent food, a second-hand bicycle. None of it fills the hollow where pride used to live. The Americans launch re-education programs for veterans, teaching new civic values, obedience to law instead of emperor, industry instead of battle. The irony stings. You're being trained to be peaceful as thoroughly as you were once trained to kill. Still, something softens in the air. Children return to school. Women cut their hair short and laugh in the streets. Jazz drifts from cafes. It feels wrong, but also necessary. Maybe peace, you think, doesn't have to feel noble. It just has to last. Then, one day, you're called to the local prefectural hall. They need men for reconstruction. Roads, bridges, ports. It's not soldiering, but it's purpose. You sign up. The pay is meager, but you work like a man possessed. Every beam you lift feels like redemption. Historians call this the quiet revolution of post-war Japan, the transformation of warriors into workers. The country's energy, once channeled into conquest, now fuels an economic miracle. You don't see it that way. You just see hands building instead of burning. Sometimes, When you pass other veterans on the street, you exchange nods. No words, just the mutual recognition of men who once belonged to something that no longer exists. A quirky story spreads through Tokyo in 1948. A group of ex-soldiers, too ashamed to beg, start a shoe repair shop under a banner reading, "From Boots to Hope." It becomes a small sensation. The newspapers call them symbols of rebirth. You visit one day, and the owner, missing 2 fingers, fixes your shoes for half price. "We're all patchwork now," he says. You laugh, because it's true. Still, there are dark corners. Some veterans never find peace. You hear whispers of suicides, of men who walk into the sea wearing their medals. Others join far-right movements, convinced the emperor's surrender was a betrayal. You avoid them. You've had enough of loyalty. Historians still debate whether Japan's recovery was too quick, too clean, that the shame was buried instead of faced. You don't know. All you know is that shame, like radiation, doesn't disappear. It seeps into everything. One winter evening, you visit Yasukuni Shrine. The snow muffles the city noise. You stand before the stone walls inscribed with the names of the dead. There are too many. The air feels heavy with unspoken prayers. You whisper one anyway, not for victory, but for forgiveness. Nearby, an American tourist takes a photograph of the shrine's gate. You watch him smile at the picture, oblivious to what it means. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe the world doesn't need to understand everything it's survived. As years pass, you find small joys again. The rice harvests return. The city lights glow brighter each night. You marry, have children. You never tell them what you saw. When your son asks what you did in the war, you say, "I came home." It's enough. Historians still argue whether that silence, shared by millions, was cowardice or wisdom. You decide it's both. Some truths are too heavy to hand down. By 1952, the Americans leave and Japan regains its sovereignty. Crowds cheer, waving flags not of empire, but of endurance. You watch from afar, too old to wave, too tired to cheer. The country has become something you hardly recognize. Peaceful, prosperous, restless. You walk the streets and see neon signs where air raid sirens once stood. The smell of grilled fish replaces the smell of ash. You think, maybe this is what victory actually looks like, survival without pride. One night, you dream of the sea again. Not the sea of war, but of calm, stretching endlessly under moonlight. You wake with tears on your face and realize they're not from sadness, but relief. For the first time in years, you believe the war is truly over. You think the war is finally finished, done, sealed, filed away in history's cold cabinet. But the ghosts don't file themselves neatly. They come back in unexpected ways. Through trials, through headlines, through memories you didn't ask for. By 1946, a new kind of battle begins. Not for land, but for truth. The world turns its gaze eastward, to Tokyo. There, in a courtroom built inside a former military academy, 28 of Japan's highest leaders stand accused. They call it the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials. You listen to the broadcasts at home, the translation filtered through static, the words heavy with a moral weight that even defeat hadn't delivered. The Americans lead the prosecution, but judges come from across the globe: Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Australia, India. The defendants are a gallery of ghosts from your old world: generals, admirals, politicians, men who once decided the fates of millions. Among them, Hideki Tojo, the square-jawed former prime minister who once declared war on the West. Now he sits in the dock, wearing thick glasses and a look of polite resignation. Historians still debate whether the Tokyo trials were fair justice or political theater. You don't have the luxury of philosophy. To you, it's strange, watching men who once demanded total obedience now bowing to foreign judges. You feel neither sympathy nor hatred, just distance, like you're observing another species. The charges are enormous. Class A for crimes against peace, Class B for conventional war crimes, Class C for crimes against humanity. The prosecutors speak of atrocities in Nanking, slave labor in Manchuria, the torture of prisoners. You know some of it's true. You heard rumors in the field, rumors everyone pretended not to hear.
But there's also something uncomfortable in the proceedings. The silence about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The mushroom clouds hang over the trial like invisible witnesses no one dares to call. Justice, it seems, has its own hierarchy.
Still, the evidence piles up. Film reels, testimonies, photographs. You see faces of Chinese civilians, Allied prisoners, women in camps. You see what the Empire's silence concealed. It makes you sick, but also strangely calm. At least now it's being named. A quirky moment occurs during the trial. One of the judges, Radhabinod Pal of India, argues that the entire process is hypocritical. Victor's justice, he calls it. He votes to acquit all defendants, citing colonial double standards. His dissent will be buried for decades, but later celebrated in Japan as a sign that not all the world condemned us. You're torn between gratitude and unease. It's comforting to be defended, but painful to see truth diluted by politics. The trial drags on for more than 2 years, longer than Nuremberg. The world moves on. You go back to work, building bridges while those men build their defenses. Finally, in late 1948, the verdicts arrive. 7 are sentenced to death, 16 to life imprisonment, 2 acquitted. When Tojo's execution is announced, you feel nothing. Maybe that's the truest punishment of all. Not hatred, not closure, just indifference. Historians still argue whether the Tokyo trials changed Japan or merely buried its guilt under legal formalities. For many veterans, they mark the end of one chapter and the start of another. Silence.
You see it everywhere.
Men who once marched proudly now avoid eye contact on trains. The word senji, wartime, becomes taboo, replaced by polite euphemisms like those difficult years. The collective amnesia begins, slow and efficient, like post-war reconstruction itself. You can't entirely blame them. The new Japan, under American supervision, is booming. The war feels embarrassingly primitive compared to the glow of neon lights, the hum of factories, the laughter of children who've never heard an air raid siren. Who would want to remember? Yet memory doesn't ask permission. It just waits. You meet an old comrade one afternoon in a small tea house. He's aged twice as fast as the calendar says. You talk about ordinary things, weather, family, the rising price of rice. Then, suddenly he asks, "Do you ever think it was all for nothing?" You hesitate. "I think it was for everything we didn't understand." He nods. Maybe that's worse. Historians might call that survivor's guilt. You just call it honesty. The Tokyo trials spark smaller ones across Asia. In Singapore, Manila, Hong Kong, thousands of Japanese officers and soldiers are tried for local crimes. Some deserve it, some don't. Many confessions come under duress. Justice, like war, is messy when applied en masse. One quirky anecdote emerges years later. A British officer overseeing a prison in Burma teaches Japanese inmates how to grow tomatoes, saying that discipline should feed the living, not bury the dead. The gesture seems small, but it captures something profound: the slow, human unraveling of vengeance into compassion. At home, the government treads carefully. Officially, it cooperates with Allied justice. Unofficially, it distances itself from the trials, calling them historical necessities. You sense the political shift even before it becomes policy. By 1952, the occupation ends. The same men who once bowed to the Americans now sit in parliament, crafting Japan's new destiny. Historians still debate how much of post-war Japan's democracy was genuine reform and how much was strategic amnesia. But in the streets, no one debates. They're too busy living. By the mid-1950s, Japan's economy surges. The war that shattered you becomes a catalyst for modernization. The same factories that once forged Zero fighters now produce sewing machines and scooters. Western brands fill the markets. Coca-Cola, Nikon, Toshiba. The country that once rejected foreign influence now thrives on it. You walk through Ginza one evening and see an American soldier holding hands with a Japanese woman. No one stares. You realize how quickly occupation became coexistence. But coexistence isn't forgiveness, it's distraction. Beneath the surface, the unspoken lingers. The veterans' hospitals are full. The widows' pensions are small. The orphans grow up calling their lost fathers the defeated. You visit a rehabilitation center one day to deliver supplies. In one room, you meet a man who lost both legs in Burma. He sits by the window, carving small toys from scrap wood. It helps, he says, to make something that smiles. You nod, unable to reply. That night, you dream of the jungle again, the endless green, the ghosts that never asked for justice, only memory. Historians still argue whether Japan ever truly confronted its past. Some say yes, pointing to peace education and apologies. Others say no, citing denial and revisionism. You think the truth lies somewhere in between, like a scar, visible only when the light hits just right. By 1960, Japan signs new treaties with the United States. The alliance becomes permanent. You read about protests from students demanding full sovereignty. You understand their anger, even admire it. But you also know what it's like when sovereignty is used to start wars. A quirky rumor floats around that year. Emperor Hirohito, the same man whose voice announced surrender, spends his evenings quietly breeding tropical fish. You imagine him hunched over an aquarium, tending to small, fragile lives. It seems symbolic. After presiding over death, he now nurtures silence. The Tokyo trials fade into textbooks. The names of Tojo and his peers become trivia answers. The moral debates move to lecture halls, far from the men who lived their consequences. You're not bitter about it. History always outsources its pain to younger generations. Sometimes, on quiet nights, you wonder what would have happened if Japan had won. If the empire had endured. Then you shiver, realizing how easily that thought comes, how close humanity always is to repeating itself. You close your eyes and picture the courtrooms, the flags, the translators, the fragments of justice stitched together with rhetoric. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a reminder that even after the worst crimes, someone has to speak. Maybe that's all history really is. A courtroom without walls, where memory and denial take turns giving testimony. You finish your tea, pay the bill, and step into the Tokyo night. Neon glows where the bombs once fell. The city hums like a heartbeat restored. You pause for a moment, listening to the laughter of strangers, and think, perhaps this is the verdict we earned. Not guilt or glory, but the simple right to go on living. You think the story must end somewhere. But history has a way of outliving even its witnesses. By the late 1960s, you are old enough to see the faces of men who never saw the war, arguing passionately about it on television. Professors debate revisionism. Students march with banners reading "Peace Forever." And politicians issue apologies one month and retract them the next. You watch from your small apartment window, cigarette glowing like a lonely lighthouse, wondering if anyone really wants the truth or just a version of it they can sleep beside. Japan has rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse. Skyscrapers rise where ashes once smoldered. The trains run on time, the factories hum day and night. It's a new kind of battle, fought with deadlines and export quotas instead of bullets. You marvel at the transformation. And yet, you can't help noticing that prosperity doesn't silence ghosts. It just gives them newer homes. Historians still argue about this economic miracle. Was it America's money, Japan's discipline, or something darker, guilt transmuted into productivity? You don't know You just see men who once saluted flags now bowing to time clocks. You visit the War Memorial again in 1970. It's cleaner now, marble polished, the air less heavy. Children giggle as they chase pigeons between the pillars. You sit on a bench, hands resting on your cane, and listen to the temple bell toll. Each chime feels softer than before, as if even memory has grown tired of itself. A young student notices you and sits nearby. He's carrying a notebook and a camera. "Were you in the war?" he asks shyly. You nod. He brightens. "We're making a documentary about the soldiers' experiences." You sigh. "Everyone wants our stories now that we're dying off." He laughs awkwardly, but then he says something that catches you off guard. "We just want to understand how it happened. Why people followed orders." You think about that for a long moment. Finally, you answer, "Because we were told that obedience was honor, and no one wanted to be dishonored." Even when the orders made no sense, he writes that down, his pen scratching like a quiet apology. Historians later call this new generation the questioning heirs, young people who no longer treat the past as sacred, but as solvable. They fill libraries with books dissecting every mistake, every silence. It comforts you to know that the conversation didn't end with your generation. A quirky cultural twist unfolds around the same time. Japan's cinema begins exploring its wartime trauma. Films like Fires on the Plain and The Human Condition show starving soldiers, moral collapse, the unbearable weight of survival. The public debates whether such portrayals are unpatriotic. You watch them all, quietly amazed that what you once lived through can now be projected onto a screen, tidy, lit, and watchable. The pain, edited into art. Sometimes, though, the pain leaks back out. One night, you dream again of the jungle, but this time, the faces are gone. Only shadows remain. You wake to find the radio playing news about another soldier discovered on a remote island, Shoichi Yokoi, found in Guam after 28 years hiding in the forest. The announcer calls him the last holdout of the emperor. You sit frozen, imagining his hands, his hunger, his stubbornness. When reporters ask Yokoi what kept him alive all that time, he replies, "It was my duty to return." The whole country weeps and applauds. You feel neither. You just whisper, "He never left the war. It just left him behind." Historians still debate how Japan could celebrate both its pacifism and its holdouts, how a society can condemn the war yet romanticize the men who refuse to stop fighting it. You suppose contradiction is the most human legacy of all. By the 1980s, your world has grown smaller. The city feels faster, louder, richer. Television sells dreams of luxury cars and air-conditioned happiness. You walk slower, leaning on your cane, invisible among a generation that knows only peace. And you're grateful for that invisibility. You fought for a country that no longer exists, and you'd rather the young never have to know that kind of loyalty. A strange reconciliation unfolds overseas. West Germany and Japan, once twin pillars of destruction, are now model democracies. You read about European veterans visiting Japan to discuss their shared pasts. One photograph in the newspaper catches your eye. A German and a Japanese soldier shaking hands at a memorial in Hiroshima. Their smiles look tired but sincere. You clip the picture and pin it to your wall. Two ghosts forgiving each other in daylight. Historians call this the mature phase of remembrance, the point when guilt softens into reflection and memory becomes education. You think they're right. There's something gentle about how people talk of the war now, not as propaganda or politics, but as weather, tragic, vast, inevitable, but past. And yet deep inside, you know it's not entirely past. Sometimes, when you hear the sound of helicopters overhead, your heart still flinches. When a truck backfires, you taste the metallic tang of gunpowder in your mouth. Trauma has no expiration date. It just learns better manners. A quirky anecdote makes you smile despite yourself. In 1985, A group of school children in Tokyo write letters to unknown soldiers, thanking them for building the peace their parents now enjoy. The letters are collected in a small exhibition. You visit it quietly one afternoon. The handwriting is crooked, the words simple. Thank you for surviving. You stand there for a long time, eyes wet, realizing it's the first thank you you've ever received. Historians still argue whether nations ever truly heal. They point to wars that followed, to conflicts reborn under new flags. You think maybe healing isn't a destination, it's a habit, something you have to practice every day, like breathing. By the time the 1990s arrive, you're one of the few left from your regiment. You attend reunions in dim community halls, drinking tea instead of sake, sharing more silence than stories. Some men still insist the war was noble. Others weep openly for what they did. You don't correct either of them. Memory, you've learned, is personal property. Everyone guards theirs differently. One evening, the television airs footage of a new memorial unveiled in Berlin, a monument to civilian victims. You think of all the faces erased by statistics, the Italian laborers in Soviet snow, the German boys clearing French mines, the Japanese prisoners breaking rock in Siberia, the so-called Axis, dissolved into atoms of grief. For the first time, you understand what historians mean when they say humanity was the final casualty. You turn off the television and look around your apartment. The walls are lined with small objects, a chipped canteen, a faded photograph, the medal you never wear. You touch each one gently, as if saying goodbye. That night, as you lie in bed, you think of all the men who didn't make it home. Italians who froze on the Russian front, Germans buried in French fields, Japanese lost to fever in jungles no map remembers. You whisper their names, not aloud, but in rhythm with your breath. The list is too long. It becomes a kind of lullaby. The fan hums softly in the corner. The city outside never sleeps anymore. Neon glows through the curtains like distant campfires. You realize the world has finally become what everyone claimed to fight for: restless, alive, absurdly peaceful. Historians will keep debating who was right, who was wrong, what justice meant. But as your eyes grow heavy, you know that none of that matters now. What matters is that humanity learned, at least for a time, to look at itself and flinch. And maybe that's enough. You close your eyes and picture all the prisoners, all the captors, all the nameless souls crossing invisible borders of forgiveness. The world hums with them still, somewhere between past and future. And as you drift toward sleep, the story of the Axis soldiers finally quiets. They are home now, everywhere and nowhere. So now, as you rest beneath the hum of the night, let the noise of history fade into the distance. The shouting, the boots, the orders, all softened into whispers carried by time. You've walked beside millions tonight, across continents and decades, through barbed wire and bamboo, through forgiveness and forgetting. You've seen how victory blurs, how guilt changes shape, how even ruins can bloom again. Breathe slowly. Picture a field, empty now, where grass grows over what was once a camp. The wind moves gently across it, unguarded, unafraid. Somewhere, a bell rings, a farmer's cow, not a siren, and you realize the war really did end. The faces you met, Italians, Germans, Japanese, are no longer soldiers. They are fathers, workers, memories folded into the quiet of the world. Their uniforms have turned to dust, but their lessons remain. That obedience without conscience is blindness, that mercy is stronger than ideology, and that survival, though small, can be its own kind of heroism. Let your heart beat slow until it matches the rhythm of that wind, until every story settles like snow. The night outside is wide and merciful. The world, for all its noise, still holds peace somewhere in it. And if sleep finds you now, let it be gentle. History can wait until morning.